Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers what used to be known as the global war on terror, but what we call the Long War. Today, I have a very special guest who needs no introduction, General H.R. McMaster. He's a friend of Generation Jihad and the Long War Journal. He's chairman of the board of advisors at the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. General McMaster was the 26th assistant to the president for national security affairs. He served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring as a lieutenant general in June 2018. And most importantly, HR is a Philly guy, an ardent Eagles, Phillies, Sixers, and Flyers fan, although very few of us admit the latter these days. HR, welcome to Generation Jihad. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Bill. Hey, great to be with you. And thanks for all the great work you do at Generation Jihad and Long War Journal. Learned so much from you over the years, really.
No, thank you very much, sir. It's a labor of love, as Tom, Jocelyn, and I have said for years. It's a grim topic we cover, but it's one that needs cover. So today, obviously, we're going to talk about Afghanistan. I know that one of my biggest laments on this podcast is that we just can't get away from it, but it's the anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal. And we spent a lot of time on Generation Jihad discussing Afghanistan over the last month. But I think it's, given what's happened, given what we've seen with the Taliban takeover, the fact that there is no moderate Taliban, that the Taliban government is dominated by the old Taliban, which is the new Taliban. Taliban 2.0 was always Taliban 1.0. Al-Qaeda, which never left. Its leader was killed in Kabul, being sheltered by Sirajuddin Haqqani, the Taliban's deputy emir, and as well as its interior minister. It's a topic we just can't escape. It's just too important. The policy failure, is catastrophic on so many levels. Recently, HR and I joined Cliff May and Brad Bowman on a foreign policy podcast. If y'all haven't had a chance to listen to it, I strongly recommend you do so. We covered a lot of ground there and took a good, I would say a good 30,000 to 20,000 foot view. But there was a couple of things that we talked about, HR, that I wanted to drill down a little further. And the first is the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, obviously catastrophic. But, we touched on this at the foreign policy, but I really wanted to get your thoughts on this. I think that once the decision to withdraw was made, there was no changing it. And we were given a false choice by the Biden administration: full withdrawal or complete re-engagement, meaning putting back a large number of U.S. troops in country to beat back the Taliban. But one of the things I had mentioned was that there was another way. We could have disengaged. Over time, the Afghan government wasn't prepared for us to leave, and it wasn't prepared for us to leave within 3.5 months. We needed to if the decision was, which I disagreed, but if the decision was to be made to leave, we needed to do it in a way that gave them a fighting chance. HR, if you were in charge of that third way, how would you have done this? What would this have looked like?
Well, I'll tell you, Bill, it's really the policy that President Trump put in place in August of 2017. And that policy was to continue to rely mainly on the Afghan government and security forces to secure their own country, recognizing, okay, Afghanistan is not going to become Denmark. It's going to be a violent place. It's going to be a place that is still where corruption is rife, but hopefully reducing over time with our conditionality of assistance and influence. But it was no longer a war that we were mainly fighting ourselves, right? I mean, it hadn't been for many years since the reinforced security effort of 2010 to 2012 or 2009 to 2012, and that was a sustainable strategy, Bill. I mean, I think we just talked ourselves into defeat. It just kills me, I mean, how about just not weakening the Afghan security forces, by withdrawing all of our support, how about not weakening the Afghan government by not permitting them or not making them part of the negotiations in Doha, or forcing them to release 5,000 heinous terrorists with no reciprocity at all from the Taliban. Really pulling back our efforts to help with intelligence and air support while the Taliban is committing mass murder attacks all around the country, and then announcing the timeline for our withdrawal, stopping our maintenance support. I mean, the list just goes on and on. It's almost as if by this time, Bill, the Biden administration was kind of almost partnering with the Taliban against against the Afghan government security forces. I mean, it was just crazy.
It's really, I mean, I still, a year later, year plus later from the date of the announcement, I still can't wrap my head around what President Biden was thinking. Was he just so tired of the war in Afghanistan? But it almost seems vindictive, the way that the withdrawal was announced, and how it was executed. He accused the Afghans of not fighting. He said a number of things that was, I mean, we have to remember Afghanistan was a major non-NATO ally. That's just one step below saying, we'll come to your defense, no questions asked. I mean, what are your thoughts?
And they had 70,000 killed fighting on the frontier, between barbarism and civilization for the last 20 years, So I just think that what happened is that we created the Taliban we preferred. You began the show, your intro with this, right? We created this Taliban that was separate from Al Qaeda. We a new kind of Taliban would be like, I don't know, progressive, maybe. I mean, are you kidding me? And then a Taliban that would share power. And in fact, this delusion was really continuing. This whole story hasn't been told, Bill, about how we essentially were trying to broker a coalition government. This is Al Khalilzad doing this under the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Remember, he stayed on, right, to do this. And they had this delusion that it was going to be Abdullah and Hamid Karzai and the Taliban that would share power, right? I mean, how did that work out, right? And this was, they were using the animosity toward Ashraf Ghani. I kept hearing from people as I was calling to say, hey, you guys, I hope you realize what's going to happen. When we withdraw, they'd say, well, they would complain about Ghani. I said, hey, do you prefer Hibatullah Akhundzada to Ghani? I mean, are you kidding me? So I just think that they actually cast the Afghan government into the role of enemy, right? Or and took the Taliban out of the role of the enemy.
Yeah, that is, again, I'm stammering over my words here because they must have convinced themselves that the real enemy was the Afghan government, which shares a heaping of the blame here in years of corruption and governmental mismanagement. But they, as you noted, they weren't the Taliban. Do you want Mullah Habatullah Akhundzada? Do you want Sirajuddin Haqqani, who essentially is Al Qaeda? Where does the Haqqani network end and Al Qaeda begin, or the Taliban end and Al Qaeda begins? And
if we wanted the Afghan government to reform, why not put some effort into that? I mean, what we kept doing, Bill? We kept saying, hey, we're leaving. Okay, now we're really leaving. Okay, now here's our timeline that we're leaving. And so the Afghans looked over their shoulders. This goes all the way back to actually Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, right? Who announced in 2003 that we're pulling out half of the one brigade that we had there. So what do the Afghans do? They look over their shoulder. Who's got our back? Nobody. Okay, well, time to make some accommodations, right? And the first accommodation was made by Karzai, where he said to the old warlords, hey guys, steal with impunity, right? And in return, just give me your political fealty. So it was this impunity happened from the beginning, right? This capture of state institutions by criminalized patronage networks happened from the beginning because we weren't paying attention. Now, what we could have done is put pressure on the Afghan government. When I was in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012, I kept saying, hey guys, we know the approach that, hey, if you don't reform, if you don't reduce corruption, we're going to give you twice as much money. Okay, we know that doesn't work. That's what we were doing, basically. So make assistance conditional, incentivize some of the reforms. And then, Bill, what we did after the Benghazi bombings? We closed all of our consulates in Afghanistan, and we went into a little Kabul bubble. And so what if instead of opening up this office in Doha Qatar and talking to those jackasses across the table from us, the Taliban, who were living in 5-star hotels and using Qatar as a base for them to raise money, right? I mean, what if instead of doing that, we had put that diplomatic effort into the non-Taliban Afghans, right? To get them to work better together because, yeah, it's a fractious society, right? But it became more fractious, I think, because of our short-term approach and we didn't put any effort, into getting them to work better together, And it was those divisions, right? The Taliban weren't strong. They weren't stronger than the non-Taliban Afghans in the aggregate. But because the non-Taliban Afghans were so fragmented, and fractious, the Taliban could gain a physical and especially a psychological advantage.
It's an excellent point about the Afghan government clearly needed reorganized. This should have been obvious in the mid to late 2000s that it wasn't working. We foisted a government on Afghan society that was not built for Afghan society. It was very centralized. When you have the president of Afghanistan appointing what are essentially here in the United States leaders of counties, there's a recipe for corruption.
The district, right? Absolutely, a district and at the province level, appointing all the governors. I mean, how about even something modest, where like the province nominates 3 people, and
Exactly.
The president would get to pick one or something. I mean, there are all sorts of proposals that we never really pushed for or helped the Afghans really do themselves. I mean, that's really what needed to happen.
And you had mentioned, right? We just keep giving them money. It's the same problem we had with Pakistan, right? We want Pakistan to stop supporting jihadist groups, to stop supporting the Afghan Taliban. Well, the solution to that was let's just give them more money. Maybe that'll get them to stop.
Well, this is crazy. I mean, that's why I describe it in Battlegrounds, Bill, as serial gullibility, right? I mean, it's just like, I wish we could just stop being chumps with the Pakistanis, because like every time, a new general would come in, or like a new political leader, Secretary of State or whatever, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I mean, the Pakistanis were so good at lying. They speak the Queen's English. They serve great Scotch. You think, oh man, these guys are just like us, right? And when they tell you, what they tell you is the same line all the time, right? The same line, which is first of all that they're just not strong enough really to take on the jihadist terrorists. Well, I mean, what I used to say to them is, I'm not asking you to do more against the jihadist terrorists. I'm asking you to do less, man. Do less to support them, right? And I mean that it should be easier to do less, right? And then they would also say, well, we just need, some more assistance, some more military assistance, some more economic assistance. And then we kept writing checks. And I'll tell you, Bill, when I was national security advisor, it was really hard to get the Department of Defense to stop giving the Pakistani stuff. I mean, and that's what President Trump wanted. He made it pretty damn clear. He said, I don't want to give them a damn thing until they stop supporting terrorist organizations. And I was like, yeah, great. I mean, let's run with that. But it was so hard to get people to stop doing it.
Yeah. Before, and you just anticipated my next question to you, but before then, to your point about Pakistani Scotch. Yeah. So before the Long War Journal was banned in Pakistan, I think it was like 2012 or 2013, they used to send me a bottle of Scotch every year to try to butter me up. And my friend and I always wondered, I was wondering if it was poison. So we would drink it together. And then we were wondering if there was like listening devices or tracking devices in the cork. So we would take it apart, and just in jest, of course, but they do know their Scotch. I will certainly tell you that. They stopped after we were banned. The Long War Journal was banned. So during your time as a national security advisor from, I believe it was February 2017 to March 2018, you made an effort to, I think, and it was working, an effort to reshape Afghanistan policy, take the fight to the Taliban, cut off aid to Pakistan, which I think I was very excited when I heard this. I even wrote an article and saying, hey, it remains to be seen if we could stick through it. Obviously, but it was certainly, a very positive, a decision by the Trump administration. And during that time, the Taliban controlled and contested districts. Those numbers plateaued, and they actually started to decrease a little bit, a small percentage. But we were showing success with that policy.
We were crushing them, Bill. I think we were really crushing them. And one of the biggest things that changed, one of the biggest things that changed is getting advisors back out with the Afghans who could bring in American air power. There were all these restrictions on the force, right? You could only have advisors down to like the division level or something ridiculous, right? And they need to be down with the companies and the battalions. That actually makes U.S. advisors safer too, because you're integrating your firepower, you're integrating your intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, with the maneuver forces closely, and so that was a big shift. And that made us a lot more effective and made the Afghans a lot more effective. Previously, what had happened is the Obama administration no longer considered the Taliban a designated enemy force. So the only thing you could do is defend after they attacked you. It was crazy. It was crazy. So we made some big shifts that didn't require more troops. Now we needed some more air power, and actually we do deploy some more advisors. But it was, it was like 10,000 or something, Bill. Like the idea that, and Brad Bowman has done some great work on this. Just saying, hey, listen, I mean, 10,000 troops is minuscule, from a historical perspective.
Now, was there an element of risk aversion with the Obama administration as well because of the green on blue or the insider attacks? Did that play a role in not getting them down at the company in the or battalion Kandak or the battalion level?
I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. And that was a difficult time, and what was, I think, immensely important. And this is what I stressed. I visited Afghanistan in April of 2017 to try to jumpstart a decision, right? I mean, just make any decision, because what we were doing in 2017 was we were fighting still, but we weren't really even recognizing it was a war. It was, I think it had become almost unethical, Bill, right? Because we no longer had a just end in mind, to use Thomas Aquinas's just war, theory and criterion for just end. And so when I got there, I delivered, pretty tough messages to the Afghans, like, hey, you better get your act together, in terms of reform within the Ministry of Interior, in particular, the Ministry of Defense was going better. But I had a one-on-one meeting with Ashraf Ghani, and brought up, obviously the green on blue or whatever, this is the attacks on U.S. forces by Taliban infiltrators into Afghan forces. And in subsequent meetings, they laid out all of the vetting that they were doing, the counterintelligence work that they were doing, the changes they had been made at recruiting and at training, and it was having an effect. I mean, it was the risk was much lower at that time, and of course, what the Taliban wanted to do is they wanted to have the effect that they did have, right, which is to help stoke that that narrative that it's an endless war, that it's hopeless, that the Afghans aren't worth supporting. And that's the only way the Taliban could really win, is if we defeated ourselves. And they understood that, much like I think that the North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese communists understood during the Vietnam War, that they had to defeat our will, essentially.
Tom Jocelyn always told me a story about how he went down to Gitmo and he saw one of the detainees. It was a captured Taliban leader, if I recall. And he had a copy of Mao's Red Book that he was reading, and he asked the guard about it, and the guard or whoever was escorting him, and they're like, see, that shows they're not radical Islamists. And Tom was like, I don't think you're getting the message here. And right. That's one of those stories that he told me that well over a decade ago, and it sticks with me. These guys I'm certain they studied the Vietnam War. I think they understood that they could outlast us, that they could chip away at our will, that they could, those green on blue attacks were very, very effective in getting us to pull back from an advisory mode. You have to take risk, and the risk aversion, and it crept up into the U.S. military, not just within the political circles, but within the top levels of the U.S. military. You could speak better to that than I could, but you saw this. It was very effective strategy by the Taliban.
Yeah, and then you combine that with the mass murder attacks against civilian targets, and that was really picking up in 2017 with the beginning of the after the winter thaw, and this was the period of time in which we were trying to give options to President Trump on what to do about Afghanistan, and so it was just blow after blow that summer. President made the decision in August of 2017, and I think gave an excellent speech, that explained to the American people why Afghanistan matters to us. He did it through the lens of American interests. And then made the case for a sustainable, reasoned strategy, right? That made sense in terms of achieving a political outcome in Afghanistan, consistent with our long-term interests of ensuring that Afghanistan never again became a safe haven and support base for jihadist terrorists, and that was really to have an Afghan government and security forces bearing the brunt of that fight, strong enough to sustain that fight. And again, it didn't have to be Denmark, Bill; it just had to be Afghanistan, not under Taliban control.
I call it Afghan good enough. Like, we didn't, in the sense of the Taliban, right? They built their army to be Afghan good enough. They weren't going to defeat us on the battlefield. They could chip away at our will, but they were Afghan good enough. They trained their military and their suicide teams to beat the Afghan military, because they knew at the end that's what would be left behind. And you mentioned something that this just sort of popped in my head, and I'm interested in your thoughts on it. You said President Trump laid it out and why it's in American interest, and one of the things that always bothers me is that people would say, well, that was in American interest, but what's in American interest was also in the interest of the Afghan people as well.
Absolutely.
And that really just needs to be stressed. The interest converged, and non-Taliban controlled Afghanistan was important for us just as much, but it was more important for the Afghan people. And you should play to those win-wins. And this is what made the withdrawal and the decision to withdraw and how it was executed so frustrated. But if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, Bill, this is a really important point, I think, Matt, because this is another element of our fundamental misunderstanding of the war. You remember the narrative of the graveyard of empires, right? What that did is it assumed, that this was a popular uprising against some kind of a colonial occupation, which it was not. Right now, as flawed as the Afghan elections were, hell, they were elections, and whenever there are informal assemblies, the loya jirgas of tribal leaders came together, they voted, I think, unanimously for a strategic partnership and relationship with the United States. This is at a time even when Karzai was kind of lobbying almost against that strategic agreement, because he had been, I believe, manipulated in large measure by the ISI, but this Pakistani's, shadowy, military intelligence arm of their army. So I think, this narrative of graveyard of empires played into the endless wars mantra, which led to self-delusion and self-defeat.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a conversation just last evening with a couple of friends, those of us who, if you're listening, you know who you are, who have talked about these issues and tracked these issues for a long time. And, kind of came to the conclusion we should have known the game was up with Karzai by 2007, 2008. Started cutting deals with the Taliban in Musa Kala, where the Brits let the Taliban control the district, and then the Taliban went wild. And at this point in time, we were releasing Afghan or Gitmo detainees to Afghanistan, and then they started getting immediately released. The most prominent of those, Mullah Abdul Qayyum Zakir, he was released we sent him to Afghanistan in late 2007. The Afghans released him in 2008. He was immediately named the Taliban leader in Helmand in, I believe it was Nimruz or Uruzgan province.
Right. They became military commanders and shadow governors, almost all of them that we released.
And then he became the Taliban's overall military leader. And now, just the other day, the Taliban announced that he's their leader in Panjshir, military commander in Panjshir province. He's also a deputy defense minister for the Taliban's Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which tells you about the problem, what the Taliban think about that problem there. I think, but I just think that, we should have been looking long and hard at Karzai at that point. I think you're absolutely correct. I've had those suspicions that the Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Directorate, or the ISI, was manipulating him. He was making some pretty significant anti-American statements and flirting with a lot of Taliban leaders, taking some very anti-American views.
Insulting Joe Biden when he was the vice president, when he was the vice president elect. Joe Biden visited Afghanistan before the inauguration of President Obama's first term. And he had dinner with Karzai and famously stormed out of the dinner in December of 2008. And I think that's another one of the reasons why Biden's like, okay, we're done with Afghanistan. I think he remembered. I think he got out of the Afghanistan that he remembered from 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. It was a different Afghanistan, a different level of commitment by us. He ended a war that he remembered from years before. Yeah,
and remember General McChrystal, the issue with General McChrystal, right? With the staff members. Right. I think there's something to be said about that, HR. I think that's a great point, that he may have just put this behind him years and years ago and was sort of stuck in the late 2000s, early 2010s with his mindset. I don't know. Well, look, we'll never know.
And the mindset is he also tended to believe that our disengagement from these complex challenges abroad is an unmitigated good. Remember, it was in December of 2010 when he was in Baghdad and he called up President Obama and said, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war." Well, hey, we should have learned from the rise of ISIS a few years later that wars don't end when one side disengages, right? And of course, in Baghdad, we disengaged militarily, but we also disengaged politically, and we just watched as Iranian influence grew and as Maliki, the prime minister, took on more and more sectarian bent to his policies that alienated more and more Sunni Arabs, which then allowed Al-Qaeda to portray themselves as patrons and protectors of beleaguered communities, and then you get ISIS, right? So I just think that our disengagement from these problems is never good, and you know what? You wind up having to go back, like we did in Iraq, in Syria, in a significant way, to fight a terrorist organization that took control of territory the size of Great Britain, but it still didn't control a state, Bill. Now you have a terrorist organization in charge of a country. And they're issuing passports, and I think the jihadist terrorist threat is much more dangerous as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick point on Biden. I remember I was embedded with U.S. Military transition teams with U.S. Army in Mosul in 2008, and I believe Biden, obviously, I don't remember if he was president-elect or I think he was still a senator, and he was calling for the partition of Iraq, and I had a meeting with. There were multiple generals, Iraqi generals. There were Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia generals, right? And what Biden was calling for was to create a Kurdish, a Shia, and a Sunni area of Iraq. And these guys were wildly confused. And they're like, we're Iraqis. This is our country. Why is the United States want to divide us? I believe it was Bob Gates who said something to the effect that he's been on the wrong side of every foreign policy.
Yeah, he did in his memoir. He tells a story in his memoir. Bob Gates does of driving back to the Pentagon one time and saying to his aide, hey, we have to relook this because I think I agreed with Biden on this. He said he never agreed with him on anything. And when the one time he did, he was really suspicious of his own beliefs as a result. But
he was against the raid to kill Osama bin Laden. I mean, listen, I understand weighing the risk on that, but if the intel's that good, I mean, I just don't think you could be more wrong than he's been in the last several decades.
Yeah. No, it's tough. He's got a really strong track record of being wrong, for sure.
I mean, and this one, I mean, how frustrating is it to hear him stand up and say, a year ago, Al-Qaeda's gone. Why do we need to be in Afghanistan? To standing up 11 months later and saying, we killed the head of Al-Qaeda in Kabul. I mean,
right. Well, I'll tell you, this remember, this happens across multiple administrations, though, too, Bill, right? So I know we're being very critical of President Biden, but hey, there's plenty of criticism to go around. It was President Obama who said, "Oh, Al-Qaeda is a shadow of its former self." You know who else said that? Was the Secretary of State under the Trump administration? Yep. He said the same words.
I would call them the D words. HR done, decimated, defeated, degraded, and then we had to add a G word with the gone, but it's close enough. Right. Frustrating. Right. And yeah, listen, I mean, the listeners of our show certainly know that I am the biggest proponent of sticking the failures of Afghanistan on multiple administrations. We could do a whole David Kilcullen in an upcoming podcast are going to discuss. We go in depth into the failures of each administration. I thought it would be like a 10-minute conversation, and we wind up talking about it for an hour. So brace yourselves, listeners. So I'm going to turn back, HR, to your time as National Security Advisor. As we noted, we're starting to see success. And then you leave in, I believe that was March 2018. Shortly afterwards, several months afterwards, President Trump reinitiates talks with the Taliban. Now, I know you're not on the inside at this point, but I got to imagine you're still talking to people. If you're free to talk about this, what happened to change his mind so quickly? Why didn't he see success?
Well, he always had people in his ear with the end the endless wars mantra, right? And so, I think that it just wore on him over time. I mean, I really think so. And then I think what else may have contributed to it is, if you remember, the Department of Defense wasn't doing any press conferences, man. Like none. Nobody was talking to the American people about the war, or you really maybe through Fox News, the president. I mean, it's important, I think, for Americans to understand what their sons and daughters are accomplishing in war. And we were really terrible at that communications. Not that you should try to put a happy face, right, on anything. Right? Afghanistan was still, I mean, a very problematic, country and insecure and lots of problems, right? I mean, say all that up front, but also, how many Americans got to hear from Afghans about the life that they were enjoying and the contrast between that and the hell that they were in between 1996 and 2001 under the Taliban, and how many Americans knew what we were doing to the enemy, right? And I think in this period of time, really going all the way back to the Obama administration, because they didn't want to talk about the war either.
It was the good war, but let's not talk about it.
Let's not talk about it. And so you get this idea that Americans warriors, who are engaged against these enemies of all civilized people, are hapless recipients of enemy action. The only thing that you hear about are casualties. Really, you don't hear anything about what we're doing to the enemy. And you don't want to go back to like Vietnam body count stuff or any of that. But I mean, we ought to be talking about our military prowess, what results that we are accomplishing, and why Americans should care about it, right? I mean, think about the Shoreback farm raid in 2015. How many Americans know about that, right? How many Americans know about that raid in which our Rangers, alongside of Afghan forces, wiped out the biggest al-Qaeda training camp that we had ever seen? I mean, that might be something to celebrate, but people don't even know what the hell that was, right?
Why didn't we see video of that raid? We should have seen what those camps look like. We should have. It's so frustrating. You bring up an excellent point, HR. I always say there's two major failings throughout all of the administrations. A failure to understand the nature of our enemy, which I don't think the Bush administration was 100% guilty of, but he was more guilty of this one, which is the one that all administrations made. Aside from what I would call the tactical things of how we form the Afghan government and military and all of those things. But these are like the things that you need to keep the American public engaged. Explaining the war. As you said, we didn't have to be all sunshine and butterflies and unicorns, but explain to the American people we're making sacrifices, but here's the import. Here's how the Afghan people are benefiting from it. Here's, who we're killing. It didn't have to, not body counts to me weren't important, but something. And like ISIS Khorasan, all the operations against ISIS Khorasan in 2017. And some of the most heinous people on earth, right? A spinoff of various groups, including the Pakistani Taliban, TTP, and Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or Lashkar-e-Taiba, alumni, some of them, but just a group of people that are utterly ruthless, and the enemies of all civilized people. I mean, how many Americans knew about just the whole terrorist ecosystem in that part of the world? Or how about the failed Times Square bomber? The story that the reason why his bomb didn't go off is because he was dodging, our counterterrorism capabilities, and never got the proper training, and highlighting that and saying, hey, this is why it's important that we're there, because we can't allow these terrorists to get comfortable and train up and prepare these kinds of attacks. I'm Bill Raggio. This is Generation Jihad. And today joining us is HR McMaster. We're discussing the debacle that is Afghanistan. Yeah, I'm putting together, I just finished compiling a list of senior and mid-level al-Qaeda leaders killed in Afghanistan. I picked 2010 because I just picked an arbitrary date, and eventually the list gets too long. There has to be 60 of them. These guys aren't household names, but they're important if you understand what al-Qaeda is, how it conducts its operations, what its goals, but since the American public didn't understand that, since really our press, because our government and military basically disengaged from explaining the import of staying in Afghanistan, of fighting in Afghanistan, our soldiers became victims. And that's how and once that narrative starts to stick, it's all downhill from there.
And it's a complete misunderstanding, right? Soldiers have authorship over their own futures. They exercise initiative over the enemy. And I think this might be part of our recruiting problem these days. I mean, I wish, I think young Americans don't understand, our military and how our military is determined to fight and win in battle, and I think this self-defeat in Afghanistan is one of the reasons why we have a recruiting issue these days, which I hope we can overcome. And I would encourage, young men and women to volunteer to serve because it's tremendously rewarding. I mean, even if you just do it for a few years, you become part of a team that's cohesive, that is committed to something bigger than yourself, and a team in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you, and that's not really replicated anywhere else, Bill. So I hope we do get over this and we have more young men and women volunteering to serve in our military.
I served 6 years myself, 4 active and 2 guard. And when I got the opportunity to embed with the U.S. military in Iraq and then with the Canadian Army in the Afghanistan for a period of 4 years, those who know me and know I say this all the time. I describe it as my second childhood. It was like going back out. Now, obviously, I did it in a different capacity as an observer, but I always went out at the squad level, the company level and then I'd step back and talk to a general or a colonel, but I wanted to get out there and see what our guys and gals were doing out there. And yeah, it sticks with you. That's, when people say, thank me for my service, my response is, the honor is mine. I mean, it was one of the most consequential decisions I made in my life to serve my country, and I wouldn't give it up for anything. And if it's an experience you just can't get anywhere. And you're right. They're my brothers. I still get together every year with a couple of buddies and we go camping and reminisce about our time in the military. And it's, sorry, getting a little sentimental there, but,
yeah, no,
hit a nerve.
It's true. I mean, it's really true. It is a band of brothers and sisters, I mean, it really is. And it is tremendously rewarding. It's a privilege to serve. And I think, it's very easy to see all like the downside of serving, right? The hardships and everything. And especially the most difficult circumstances when you see, somebody you love as part of your family in the military, make the ultimate sacrifice or be seriously wounded. But what people don't see are the tremendous rewards, of serving.
Absolutely. And these reports of recruiting being down, as well as applications to the service academies, very concerning. We have to figure out a way to turn this around and to reinvigorate. But these decisions like losing wars has consequences, making soldiers into victims has consequences. And we have to figure out a way to turn this around. General, you are certainly one of the few men who I know who can lead that charge. I hope and pray that that these things turn around. Our nation's defense depends on it.
Absolutely, and I think because sadly, of the self-defeat in Afghanistan, the world's a less safe place. And I think you've seen a redeployment of some of our counterterrorism capabilities into Somalia, for example. I mean, these problems aren't going away. I mean, look at what's happening in West Africa. It is. These groups, if they're not, under some kind of duress, they become strong, and what they have going for them is they're utterly unscrupulous, Bill. So it's pretty easy to take control of a piece of territory after you behead a few people in a rural village, right? Everybody gets the message, and so it's they use fear, right? They use fear to gain control of territory, populations, and of course, that gives them ability to raise funds, and it makes them extremely dangerous.
Yeah, and that's what Al-Qaeda has now, right? It not only has a safe haven, but it has state sponsorship. This is my biggest concern. It's worse than pre-9/11. It's where the Taliban had to at least fight the Northern Alliance. That what you had just said, right? When they're being engaged on the battlefield, they don't have as much time they still try, but their ability to plot and to train, to recruit, they have to focus on survival. And once we start taking away, or once we start giving them the ability to survive, all bets are off. I always say, I don't know. No one thought before 9/11 that there would be, so they would ram airplanes into buildings to attack us, right? I don't think there may have been I believe someone in the FBI thought of that. And, but that wasn't in our minds. I don't want to give them the time and space to innovate the next type of attack, whatever that may be.
Right. Exactly. And of course, we're not talking about American soldiers, at every point. We're talking about really advising, our partners abroad who take the brunt of the fight. And of course, that's what we gave up in Afghanistan, right? Is an Afghan army, Afghan police forces that were bearing the brunt of the fight, and they're not there anymore. In fact, and the country's controlled by the terrorists that we were fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to turn back to that period in the Trump administration after your strategy was discarded. Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the State Department's advisor or negotiator with the Taliban, he comes into light. He takes the limelight as he opens up negotiations with the Taliban. While you were initiating this strategy, while you were in as national security advisor, was the State Department pushing for talks at that point in time? And did you have any interactions with Khalilzad during your time as national security advisor?
I know Sal Khalilzad pretty well. I know him from both Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm very disappointed in the role that he played. I just have to say that. I mean, I told him that. He knows that. But I think that the State Department, is always trying to negotiate. It's like the Geico commercial. It's like it's what they do. They negotiate. And so even when it makes no sense to negotiate, they can't help themselves. They can't help. And so I talked about trying to get the Defense Department to stop, giving stuff to the Pakistanis. It was hard to get the State Department to stop falling all over themselves trying to negotiate with the Taliban, and it became almost like a cottage industry, right? It was like, and it made good material for, I think, for, cocktail parties in Washington that you got to talk to the Taliban. It was just, hey, there was no need to talk to them at that point, I don't think. We forgot just some of the fundamentals of fighting wars. Defeating your enemy means convincing your enemy that your enemy is defeated, right? Which means that in this case, the Taliban would have to recognize they can't accomplish their objectives through military force. Well, what we were doing is like the opposite. We weren't even actively targeting them. We had stopped, again, in the Trump administration later. They stopped really them as a designated enemy and pursuing them. Then we gave them a timeline for a withdrawal. Then we're talking to them. How does that work? Right? It doesn't work. We were completely misaligned between what we're doing militarily and what we're hoping to achieve diplomatically.
Yeah, one of the common refrains, and once I heard generals start to say this, I knew the game was up for real, was that there was no military solution to Afghanistan. And yet, we watched the Taliban execute a military solution to Afghanistan. They were the ones who wore us down. They convinced us that we couldn't win. And that was the military, and I'm speaking in, I'm talking military leadership here, not you guys at the company, platoon, battalion, brigade, even division level, but I'm talking about the top tier leadership of the U.S. military. General Nickerson, commander of Afghanistan, said we needed a political solution in Afghanistan. I want my generals to fight and my diplomats to negotiate. And I think once that line was crossed, you had General Nicholson and General Miller, who became the last commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan and Resolute Support Mission as well. There was no chance for us. I felt at that point in time. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I have great respect for both those guys. They're both friends of mine. And I think that their frustration, and this is a actually legitimate concern of theirs, not to speak for them, but there was no political strategy, right? So if you have a political strategy, then you can conduct military operations to support it. And if the political strategy, I think, should have been that, that we trying to harden and strengthen Afghanistan against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, and then weaken the Taliban physically by going after them very hard militarily, but also financially, and then working on the problem inside out by trying to help Afghanistan be more cohesive politically and work better together across the different groups within the country. But then work outside in. That's where the diplomatic work should have been going as well, like toward Pakistan, countries in the region, to play a more productive role, and then also to sustain the international effort, which was already bearing much of the burden. I mean, I think there were 3 times more international troops in Kabul toward the end than there were U.S. troops. Bill, I think that's what they meant. Hey, I mean, I don't know. I don't know exactly what they were thinking at the time. But their job was to, obviously, as you're alluding to convince the Taliban they couldn't accomplish their objectives through the use of force by kicking their ass, right? I mean, that's what we should have been doing, and we started doing that in 2017, and then we just stopped. We just talked ourselves into defeat.
Yeah,
and then you had the surrender agreement, February 2020.
I think though, I always say, it's sort of a version. If you don't have anything good to say, don't say it at all. I think that, you know, the generals, when the generals start talking about there is no military solution, they didn't have to say anything.
Yeah.
I think they fed the problem by buying into that, right? And
no,
generals
because,
sitting
it's
down with the Taliban and openly talking about political settlements. Like they should have, if they didn't agree with it, I felt they should have kept quiet about it. And that might be my real beef with this.
Yeah, I don't know. We're gonna have to wait to see their perspectives, you know, because both of them have been professional and quiet about this, you know, Nicholson and Miller, and they're both, you know, extremely honest, forthright people. So I think when it's time for them to give their perspective, I think we'll have another valuable piece of the picture. But I do think that, they were under such constraints. I mean, you know, and in terms of, you can't have advisors down below this level. You can only have X number of aircraft. You can only, I mean, it was just like we weren't serious about fighting it. That changed little by little in 2017. You know, the rules of engagement were like, you know, a big paragraph of what you can't do, and lawyers were interpreted. It was like, I mean, it was really, for both of them, very difficult, I think, to take advantage of all the capabilities that we could have brought to bear against the Taliban. And as you mentioned, you know, we started to do that in 2017 in terms of the enablers and the intelligence and the air support. And then we just, you know, when we started talking with the Taliban again, we stopped actively targeting them. I mean, it was, if you want the enemy to make concessions, you have to impose costs on that enemy. I mean, it's just astounding to me that we told them we're leaving and then started to negotiate with them. It just makes no sense. But two administrations did that: the Obama administration and the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. They definitely put the cart before the horse on this one. It made no sense. And this gets back to not understanding your enemy too. I don't think the Taliban really ever were going to make concessions. Anyway, look, I could recall reading statements. They put these out in English, and one of them that always sticks with me, I believe it was from 2016, where I'm paraphrasing here, but it's almost word for word, where they said, why would we sacrifice ourselves for decades for a silly ministerial post? The Taliban was very serious about Islamic Emirate or bust, and they got Islamic Emirate. I want to turn back to, okay, so, you know, you said that, you know, General Nicholson was constrained, General Miller was constrained. Then we have the way the withdrawal was executed, which was really, I mean, I think if we talked to a lieutenant or even a sergeant and would have said, hey, we're leaving Afghanistan and we may have to plan an evacuation, we're going to close Bagram Air Base and keep about 1,000 troops in Kabul. Is this a good idea? And their jaws would drop. Yet we had generals sign off on this. At what point do you think a general at some point should have stood up and said, I can't execute this? Should have General Nicholson, or should have General Miller, or should have, in my opinion, I think General McKenzie at the point of withdrawal, he probably was the most responsible here. My opinion is, and by the way, I understand I just want to be clear. I do understand the perils in how it could be perceived. But at some point, I felt someone needed to stand up and say, this is a bridge too far and I can't do this. I can't execute this mission without putting my people in peril, without putting, you know, our national interest in peril. Do you think that was an option? Or
I think they did it, Bill. I mean, we're going to ask them, you know, but I think they said, hey, listen, if you give us this timeline and this troop cap, it's going to be a disaster. I mean, I'll tell you, I think you're right. Any captain, sergeant could have seen that happening. You know, I mean, evacuating out of Kabul airport, that's crazy. There's no security. There's no perimeter that you're pushing right into an urban area. You know, just the max on the ground of aircraft and the ability to conduct an evacuation in an orderly fashion would mandate that you would keep Bagram Airfield open, right? But now you're talking about, probably a brigade organization that would have to be there, but you know that they gave it a firm troop cap. You know, I mean, I just think that we have to hold our political leadership accountable, and I don't want to be an apologist for generals and that kind of thing. That's not what I'm trying to do. I do think that there's plenty of blame to go around here, but once that, I think the Biden administration, I think President Biden in particular, was like, the military is always going to ask for more. They're always going to ask for more time. They're always going to ask for more troops. What did you not hear me tell you to do? I told you to 2,500 troops and out by, September, whatever, the September 1st.
September 11th,
right?
Believe it or not, at the beginning.
September, yeah, I know. I mean, geez, but that was crazy. That was crazy too. I mean, I can't believe that.
Right?
But that was just a slap in the face of what that was. So but I just think that's what happened, Bill. I mean, and then, if you have 2,500 troop cap, you can't keep Bagram open. You just can't do it. Now, Brad Bowman and I wrote an essay in the Wall Street Journal in the summer of, before the collapse in the summer of 2021, and we basically said, unless the Biden administration does these 6 things, it's going to be a disaster in Afghanistan. I mean, it was so clear to any of us who've been studying it seriously. And of course, these 6 things were things that the Biden administration was not about to do, and it was to intensify our air support. It was going to be, to keep Bagram open. It was going to be, I mean, these are the, all the things that in retrospect were necessary if we were going to avoid this just utter disaster, a humanitarian catastrophe, and then really a humiliation on our way out of the country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's once the decision was made to withdraw, he ran for the exits quickly and was not looking for sage advice. HR, any parting thoughts before we leave?
Well, of course, it's not over. I think that's the main point, Bill, is it's not over for Afghanistan, right? There are plenty of Afghans who don't want to live under Taliban rule. I think that we have to really start looking hard at whether or not we will support opposition groups who are trying to organize themselves and begin to at least throw the Taliban out of parts of Afghanistan. And if you care about the humanitarian catastrophe there, I think that's really the only solution to this is the Taliban out, because no matter how much aid you give, the real cause of the humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan is the Taliban. And so again, war is an extension of politics, and what needs to happen is a political future for Afghanistan that does not include an organization that is using a draconian, perverted interpretation of Islam to justify their criminality and the repression of human freedom.
I could not agree with you any more than that. It's we need to consider supporting the resistance. Any money we send to Afghanistan, any aid, only props up the Taliban. We need to be thinking about ways of helping the Afghans themselves eliminate Taliban rule. General McMaster, thank you so much for joining us, and please join us again soon. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Hey, thanks, Bill. And it's looking pretty good for the Eagles, I think, this year.
I think so, too. I'm very, very excited. And, I think the Phillies might have a little chance.
I know. Hey, they've been on quite a run. I mean, it has some huge winning streaks, and I think just a little more pitching, a little more pitching. And
Yeah. And getting, we got to get Harper back, too. I mean, that's going to be a nice add. A little hitting there.
That's right.
Thank you again for joining us. And thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.